Hello and welcome to the Boostara podcast. I am your host, James. On the Boostara podcast, we meet leaders in business and education and uncover the truths and insights from their amazing experiences. At Boostara, we help businesses leverage AI to boost growth, cut costs, and gain business insights. If you would like to learn more about how we can help you, then please write the word growth into the comments below and I'll be sure to reach out. Today, we are very fortunately joined by the amazing Jan Dubiel, early years consultant and director at Hempstalls. Hello, Jan.
Hi, James, and thanks for inviting me on. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's amazing to have you here. And early years is something of an interest and passion of mine personally. We mentioned off air. I do have a 4-year-old somewhere in this house that may just suddenly appear, which would be quite pertinent to the conversation. But Jan, could you tell us where are you calling us from today?
So I'm based in Margate in Kent. I work certainly across the UK, but also internationally. My background is, as you said, I've always been a specialist in early years as a teacher, consultant, a local authority advisor. But I also spent some time living and working in China as the director of early years for International School Group.
Wow.
So I like to think I have a multi-dimensional view of both childhood and early childhood education, but also early childhood educators and practitioners. There's a lot of commonalities in terms of what I see globally, and it's very interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, for people involved with early years, they may be familiar with you, may have come across you at seminars or even in trainings. But for those that aren't familiar with early years, could you give us a little bit of a backdrop insight into yourself and I suppose, your journey
Mm.
through education and how you've found yourself where you are now?
Yeah, I mean it's sorry, yeah, that's a really good place to start. Often when I do training, if it's a whole day's training or it's a project, we start with an exercise where we do precisely that. We talk about our journey. How have you become an early years educator? What's been your pathway? And it's, really interesting, the collection of stories I've amassed over the years in terms of where people have come from. But I do think, although it's a little bit cliched, I do think it's true that you don't choose to become an early years educator, it chooses you. Because in all those stories, there is a moment where you kind of, you almost have almost, dare I say it, spiritual moment where you think, this is what I was meant to do. This is what absolutely fits. So everybody, when I do that exercise, everybody comes up with their own version of that, their own moment where they do that. So that's how I started. I think I was interested in education broadly, but I hadn't really even considered early years. And I think originally I was thinking probably about secondary education.
Mm.
And but everyone who I knew was saying to me, "Oh, are you sure? Because you'd be really good in primary. I think you'd really like that." So I did some sort of work experience in a primary school, and I worked with all the age groups. And it was when I walked into the nursery provision, the 3 to 4 year old provision, that I had that moment, and I
Mm.
thought, no, this is what it's all about. So I pursued a very specific and specialist early years path. So I taught 2 year olds, 3 year olds, reception, nursery, and year one children, and I did that for a number of years. Then I worked as a local authority advisor, a local authority consultant, and then I spent some time working for the government at the time, as the national lead on the assessment, the UIFS profile, which is the end of reception year assessment, which we still have now. Then worked for a company called Early Excellence as the national international director. And then, as I said, I worked in Southeast Asia, in China and Hong Kong, based in China and Hong Kong,
Mm.
working as an international, as the director of early years for International School Group. Now I do work for Hempstalls. I also work for the education people based here in Kent, and I do a lot of work independent. sort of freelance consultative and advisory work.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so my main spheres of interest are around the concepts of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, how they merge together, and how we create those moments, those trajectories of learning. And I think what I've noticed in my career is how more complex and more multifaceted those are becoming. Take for example COVID, take for example the pandemic. That shone a very bright spotlight on some of the fault lines, if you like, in some of our provision. So things like emotional well-being, things like
Mhm.
language development, things like social development, they were certainly highlighted and exacerbated by the pandemic, but they raised real questions about how do we facilitate that? How do we support that? How do we fine tune what we do around those individual those journeys that children take? One of my favorite, I don't know, you spent time in China as well. One of my favorite Chinese proverbs is, there are many paths to the top of the mountain, but the view is always the same.
Mhm.
And I think what's fascinating is whatever our perspective or even our sort of cultural context or our philosophy, everyone really ultimately wants the same thing for children. That's the view from the top of the mountain. Everyone wants children, yes, to be literate, to numerate, to be well educated, to be knowledgeable, to be skillful, but we also want children to be excited about learning, to be motivated, to be
Mhm.
able to be critical thinkers, to have high levels of emotional literacy, and so on. So I think what I'm really interested in is those paths to the top of the mountain. How do we make sure that those facilitate those individual learning journeys? And I think one of the things we're really discovering in early years is that a sort of one size fits all approach doesn't work for all children.
Mhm.
And why would it? Children are so complex and so intricate and so idiosyncratic. We have to be constantly adapting towards that. So that's one of my big areas as an educator. The other thing on a slightly more strategic level is how we present that and how we describe that and how we articulate what we know about young children. Early years is a bit of an unknown area. If you're not an early years educator, and you're looking from the outside, unless you have that understanding of why we do what we do, some of it does appear to be counterintuitive. Some of it does appear to be kind of certainly different from how you would work with, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old children and so on. So I think firstly, it's really important that people understand early years, people understand why we do what we do, the way we do it,
Mhm.
but also as a profession, as a community, as a sector, that we represent ourselves in a way that engages with that understanding. And I think in the past, early years has been a bit of a secret garden. And I think that's one of the things I think really needs to change. Everyone should understand early childhood development. Everyone should know what that looks like, why it is, why language is really important, why physical development is really important, why having back and forth interactions with children is the mainstay of how children's brains develop. All those kinds of things should be part of a broader cultural knowledge, whether you work with young children or not. And I think that's also part of what I'm trying to do.
Amazing. Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate what you said about early years finds you, right? Or teaching finds you rather than you
Mm,
choose teaching, and
mm,
specifically early years. Myself, I've gone through all of the age groups, from adults found
mm,
when teaching adults can be predictable, but also can be a little bit venomous. You have the happy face looking at you whilst you're training adults, but then they go and complain back office, about you. Um, Older kids, that sort of teenage range, is just a non-respondent kind of atmosphere, right? They're just looking at you with blank faces, a lot of the time disinterested. Um, but for me, it gets more interesting the younger they get, because the younger they are, and especially going into the early years, the more the more the more honest they are about what you're doing. Like, you
mm,
see the reflections of, is what you're doing interesting or not, you can see it in real time playing in the way that they are reacting to you. If
Mm.
if you're boring, then you will see that disinterest straight away. If you're
Yeah.
interesting, you've got something engaging, you'll have that.
Mm.
Yeah, and
Mm.
I totally relate to that with probably with early years about the energy. I think that's the thing that
Mm.
drew me in. But also what you mentioned about that Chinese proverb. I mean, one thing that stuck with me from China was the analogy that children are like precious stones. So
Mm.
you dig up the precious stones like children
Mm.
from underground, but when you first get those stones, they don't look like jewels. They don't look like diamonds, rubies, whatever. All misshapen, dirty, ugly. And the point of education is to sort of as horrible as it sounds, but to clean the jewel, to
Polish it,
shape
but
it,
yeah,
to
yeah.
polish it, to show it for what it truly is. And no one child is, like you said, one size fits all. No child is the
Mm.
same. We've got rubies, diamonds,
Mm.
all
Mm.
different types of precious stones, and every child is a precious stone. It's just finding
Mm.
what stone they are and being able to
Mm.
polish them in the right way,
Yeah,
right?
allow them
Yeah,
to shine.
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've not heard that analogy before. That's
You can use
that's a very
it.
that's a really good one. Yeah, and I think one of the things that one of the reasons why early years has sort of become this very sharp focus is, finally, is every culture has an equivalent of the Saint Ignatius phrase, which is "Give me the child until they're 7, and I'll give you the adult."
Mm,
And I think everyone, as I say, every culture has a version of that. And I think there's a realization that at the age of 7, that when early childhood finishes and middle childhood begins, there's this very significant, almost rite of passage from one to the other. What
mm,
we know now from neuroscience is actually the brain goes through this transformation round about that time, where myelination takes place, and the brain gets rid of connections that you're not using, and it hardwires in connections that you are using, and so on. And I think before society knew about neuroscience, educators would observe this as this process where children almost went into a different sort of phase of development, which is
mm,
physically what happens.
mm,
And children go from things like working in very concrete ways to be able to understand more abstract ways. They go into being able to respond to things differently. They develop their language, develop their means of communication, and so on. Develop their ability to retrieve and recall information, and so on. We know that, and what we also know, what that is, what we do in those first 7 years is critically, vitally important, because
mm,
it builds the architecture of the brain that is then going to go forward. So one of the things we are really interested in, and certainly I'm really interested at the moment, is how particularly we close the gap between children from lower and higher social economic status. So at the moment,
mm,
your lifelong outcomes can be defined or predicted by your social economic status, your
mm,
father's income and your mother's level of education. Now that's that's the most grotesque injustice that there is, because actually we know that children have this incredible potential, and given them the right experiences, those children can flip those trajectories. And there's huge research projects which demonstrate that. One is called "Performing Against the Odds" by the EPI study, which looked at children who were at risk of failure but ended up being really successful, and they looked at all the different elements of what changed that pathway. So we know it's possible.
mm,
Your your possibilities and your future in life is not a given. You have an opportunity to change that. And I think what we do in early years is we very much build the foundations on what that's built. So I
mm,
think one of the challenges we face is really conveying to people that actually the stuff that really matters in early years might not look like what we think is important later on.
mm,
So, for example, we know that children's social and personal development is vitally important. They establish and build learning behaviours. They establish and build things like motivation, cognitive flexibility, executive functioning, self-regulation, and so on. Now, those aren't traditional academic subjects, but they're critical to children's development.
Yeah.
Now, because they're learnt behaviour, 99% of what you do is learnt behaviour, they're therefore teachable. And
Mm.
like with anything, some children pick them up quicker than others, but
Yeah.
that doesn't mean they won't. They just need more support in terms of doing that. So that understanding of laying that foundation on which things like literacy, numeracy, understanding the world, scientific knowledge, and so on, or knowledge generally builds is really important. And I think one of the challenges we face in early years provision and early years education at the moment is finding that balance. Of course, children need knowledge, of course, they need
Mm.
skills, but they have to go alongside the attributes, the competencies, the behaviours which make those possible.
Mm.
And that's very much part of what we do as early as educators.
Mm.
And that, if you speak to, people who work with 2, 3-year-olds, that's what they will tell you when they
Yeah.
talk about their children. They will talk about them as that in terms of their personality and their attributes, what they what they're interested in, what motivates them, what keeps them focused and concentrated. Are they easily distracted? Are they or generally have high or low levels of well-being? All those
Mm.
kinds of things. And that's very much as it should be, because as I said, that lays the foundations and that builds the neurological architecture on which all future learning is built.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. I'm wondering, when you approach an early years provider, or they reach out to you for consultation and training, what sort of misconceptions do you see from those providers? It's maybe from the ownership sort of level,
Mm.
the
Mm.
management level, or even from the teachers that you then end up working with. What sort of misconceptions do you see about working with someone like you?
I think, first of all, I think people sometimes think people like me have the answer
Hmm.
and that we will tell them what that answer is. But one of the first things I will say is no such answer exists. And actually, your work as an educator is finely tuned from you as a person and your journey, I've talked about at the beginning, but also your intricate knowledge of those children. So I think one of the big misconceptions we have in early years is there is any sort of template for successful teaching, and there isn't. It's about
Hmm.
using your professional judgment. So one of the things I'm fond of saying is that research tells us that as an early years educator, you have 1,000 interactions every single day. Each one of those interactions is a life-changing moment for that child. Ian Robertson wrote a book called The Winner Effect, where he talks about, particularly about education, but he talks about kind of the process of change. And he says kindergarten teachers have the same impact on a child's brain as a neurosurgeon would have, because of that incredible growth of neurological development over that time, over that year or just less than the year that you have them. So I talk about this power of interaction and the power of the decisions you take around it.
Hmm.
I've also been really influenced by the work of Gary Klein, who's a psychologist, and he works in the arena of ideas and how we make decisions. And one of his seminal books, Sources of Power, published 25 years ago, was how people make decisions in very pressured, life-dependent situations.
Hmm.
So he was talking to people like firefighters, paramedics, air traffic controllers, people who had to make split-second decisions on which literally lives were dependent.
Yeah.
So he tried to unpick, how do they do that? How do they make these really quick decisions? And he developed this model called recognition prime decision making, which is when you feel like something, I'm summarizing it, but you need to read the book, but when you feel like something feels intuitive or gut reaction, you're actually drawing from your huge well of experience.
Hmm.
So, for example, firefighters, when they approach a burning building, they would make a snap decision and about, where to locate the water or where to start in terms of putting out the fire. And he would say, well, how did you know that? And they'd say, well, I just knew. But actually, what they were doing was subconsciously drawing from that well of deep knowledge. So I
Hmm.
remember reading that book a few years ago and it being very influential in my thinking in terms of how we work as educators. So we have these 1,000 interactions a day, which means if you work with children for 5 years or more, you have had 1 million interactions. And
Mm.
we are subconsciously drawing from those all the time. So one of the things I say to educators is, first of all, you are in charge. The locus of power rests with you. You are in charge of what you do. What I talk about is my experience. These are my ideas. This is my own pathway. Books I've read or articles I've read or conversations I've had or children I've worked with or people I've listened to, and you will
Mm.
have your own pathway.
Mm.
Be proud of that and embrace that and be confident about that.
Mm.
But be really clear that when you make a decision, make that decision from what you know about your own beliefs, your own understanding of children. One of the worst things we have in early years is something which I call compliance anxiety. And it's desperately trying to do what we think is the right thing. And at that point, you get detached from everything. If you're trying to follow what you think you're supposed to do, you lose all momentum and you lose all effectiveness in what you're doing.
Mm.
So yeah, I would say one of the misconceptions is there is a formula for this. There isn't. It's about the intimate and intricate second by second judgments that you make. Of course, there are things about how you plan, how you understand your subject knowledge, how you establish a learning environment, how you establish routines and expectations in your provision, how you choose resources, how you teach children to choose resources, how you deliver concepts like literacy and numeracy. Phonics is a huge area of development or area of focus in early years. How you teach, the number system and so on. Those are all parts of what you do. But in terms of those paths at the top of the mountain, that has to be finely tuned to the individuality of that child. I think,
Mm.
excuse me. And I think understanding that and being confident with that is a really important part of that.
Mm. Mm. That's fascinating. Yeah, you make me kind of think about the way, well, I suppose the way that I interact with my daughter, and when I've been interacting with students when I previously worked in China.
Mm.
Um, yeah, because if you second guess yourself, then and you're trying to do what you think is the right thing, that's also slowing the decision making,
Absolutely.
and everything is based off. It should be based off of quick decisions, right?
Abs
Um,
ab absolutely. And I think when
more
you
natural it
realize,
feels, then it's the smoother, the quicker, the better the results.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think often, that the most difficult thing, but the most difficult, most important thing you do as an early years educator is knowing when to interact with a child and what to say and how to support it.
Mm.
So sometimes you would interact with a child and you would reinforce something where there's a misunderstanding. Say if they were counting and they were counting out of sync and they were missing out a number, you
Yeah.
would gently interact and model it for them to kind of do that. Sometimes it's about asking the question to take them out of their learning. What would happen if? What would you do if? What happens when? And all that's part of building those sort of that sort of cognitive development.
Mm.
So getting that interaction right, because if you get it wrong, you can ruin the moment, is
Yeah.
really important. So the reason I like the recognition prime decision making model is it's exactly what you just said. It relies on that subconscious, what feels like gut reaction, what feels like instinct. It's not. It's actually deeply rooted in your knowledge and experience, but you're drawing from it subconsciously. But it's the opposite of
Mm.
compliance anxiety. It's opposite thinking, well, what should I do now? What does the book say? What did the last
Mm.
educator I listened to, what did they say I should do? Once you start thinking about that, then
Yeah.
everything unravels.
Yeah. 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 What would you say the main challenges are that have been faced by early years providers? I mean, beyond finance, because
Mm.
I can understand that
Yeah,
early years is historically underfunded, undervalued, I
mm.
think as
Yeah,
well. But I mean, beyond that, when you go into providers, the challenges based off of skills of their staff? Is it
mm.
the resources? Is it
Mm.
does it differ for every single one? I mean, are there
Mm.
just kind of trends that you see across early as providers,
Mm.
or is it really individual in nature?
Well, I think there are generic things. I mean, you've touched on financing, you've touched on recruitment, retention. Those are big challenges at the moment. Resourcing, resourcing funding are all sort of ongoing challenges we're trying to resolve or are trying to be resolved. I think one of the interesting things in early years is we have a very, very diverse sector. So a 3-year-old could be in any number of different settings. They could be with a childminder, they could be in a school, they could be in a preschool, they could be in a day nursery.
Yeah.
We have this very, very, as I said, diverse profession.
Mm.
So I think part of the challenge is making sure that there's a consistency across that. So we do all come under the same framework. We come under the early years foundation stage as a statutory framework, which should shape provision. And the principle of that is that regardless of what type of provision the child goes to, there should be an expectation of consistency of quality. And I'm not saying that's not the case, but I think
Mm.
that's something we do always wrestle with because we come from such different traditions. And particularly, I think the difference between school and non-school based provision is often quite an interesting sort of tension.
Mm.
I think so. I think that's a bigger sort of strategic picture of how early childhood education has evolved in England, particularly UK generally. I think if I was to put in one thing, it would be a word we've used a lot already, which is the idea of confidence, the idea of
Mm.
confidence in your own judgment as a professional. Um, when I go into both school-based, non-school-based provision, they can all vary in quality and in terms of outcome, in terms of effectiveness. But the one constant is how well educators know their children. Even
Mm.
where in the quality provision, I would say is not as good as another one, those educators know their children really, really well. And I think that comes naturally with the job because you've touched on the nature of young children. They transfer that loco parentis onto you. You become this incredibly significant person in their lives if you're an educator who works with young children. And again, they're still going through this early childhood phase where they are still working out how to be. They are watching the adults around them really carefully
Mm.
to understand, what makes a person, what do I have to do, and so on. So you do always have these very, very quite intense relationships with those children. And as I said, I think that's a constant wherever I go. And I
Mm.
think that's a really good thing because that's what we build on. Educators were confident in trusting their judgment in following the pathways down which children take them down, their own particular routes to the top of the mountain. If they're confident in doing that, they don't feel like they get distracted or diverted or pulled away by that compliance anxiety. Then I think that would be a massive step forward. So being confident about what you do, being really proud of the massive impact you have on children, and regardless of what happens outside, and that is an issue, being aware of the status, what you do, and the importance of it.
Mm.
As you said yourself, early years is undervalued, and I think it's undervalued because it's misunderstood or it's
Yeah.
not understood. Actually, what we know from evidence is that birth to 7 period is the most phenomenal period of neurological, physical, social,
Mm.
emotional growth. And actually, it's the biggest period, intense period of your life. From birth to 7, you make something on round about 70 to 80% of your lifetime neurological connections
Wow.
happen in that very early period. So everything that happens later builds on that. And again, I
Mm.
don't think that's always recognized. The adult who goes on to do a PhD in physics, for example, that started when they were investigating forces in their early years environment, when they were pushing cars down slopes, or they were looking at what's magnetic and what's not magnetic, or they were
Yeah.
flying a kite in the outside. All those kind of concrete experiences is what builds into both their knowledge on which it's built, but also that motivation.
Mm.
So I think understanding the thread of what the end goal, if you like, or what high levels of academic qualification look like, for example, and what that looks like in early years is really important. also remembering that it's not just about academic qualification. This is about the person you are, the citizen you are, the human being you are. And again, that's all learnt behaviour, and that starts very, very strongly in children in early years. Neil
Mm.
Postman, a philosopher, once said, when you work with children, you connect yourselves to a future that you'll never see. And that's absolutely right. That we don't know. We lose these children when they're 5 or 6, and then they go on, and we don't necessarily know what happens to them, but we
Mm.
know when we've done our job well, we've laid those foundations for a whole broad portfolio of success. Academic being one of them, but not just that. Economic, social, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose that's you'll have an opinion on this. Education more broadly often can become just a tick box exercise, like they've done this, and this. I guess for yourself, going in and working with early years providers, how do you ensure that like the professional development that you provide is something that's really taken on board, that really does give that transformation, rather than just being a tick box exercise from the provider, like, oh, we've got Jan in, done.
We've done that. Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I think what makes for effective professional development is a really, really interesting. Um, excuse me. Is a really interesting question, and it would be very interesting actually, because I know that you're not exclusively looking at education, how that kind of crosses over in terms of other disciplines, because much of my role, certainly in the last sort of 20 years or so, has been about how do we facilitate effective CPD, like you said, that has a transformative, sustained impact on the quality of practice. If your CPD doesn't directly lead to better outcomes for children, then it's not worth doing. So one of the things I think we've come to realise is that training has to be systematic. The C in continuous professional development stands for continuous.
Hmm.
So first of all, professional development isn't just about going on a course or even doing qualification. It's the articles you read, or the people you talk to, or the reflections you have, or and so on. So you are constantly processing and updating your knowledge and your understanding. Your values as a person are sort of core and unchangeable, generally speaking. Your beliefs change all the time. So as you understand more about your field, that refines and adapts beliefs and how you act within that. So I think making sure that CPD is a process, not an event, is really important. In terms of the work I do, I tend to do more sort of project type work rather than one-off training sessions. Sometimes there's a place that if you're briefing someone about a particular document, recently in our document came out about writing, and it looked at how early part of it looked at how early writing starts. So briefing people about that and the perceptions of that is part of that. But in terms of sustaining and transforming their practice and their sense of being a professional, I tend to work much more in a project-based way. So we'd do a bit of input, they would have a gap task, they would have reflective opportunities, we'd come back, review that, might do a bit more, and so on. So
Hmm.
most of the work I do at the moment is like that. It's projects over time. And that you build up that relationship, that rapport with those people, but also you create a space where they can talk about their own practice.
Hmm.
And I think one of the learning behaviors I think is fundamental to children is metacognition, how we know what we know.
Yeah.
And I think the more you reflect on that as an educator, the more confident and the more skilled you become in doing that. So yeah, I think it's an interesting development with how we best deliver CPD, and particularly with technology and
Yeah.
artificial intelligence, how that's going to impact on that is going to be really interesting.
Well, you've set up the next question. Really, I mean, with AI and
Mm,
tech, how is it changing the industry? How is it changing the way that you work?
mm,
I mean,
mm.
you mentioned 20 years, right? So you can go back
Mm,
that
mm.
far, before smartphones, before
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
how have things changed in that period of time? And do you see AI as a force for good or not so good in early years practice and in consultations like you do?
Yeah, I think it's it's an emerging area, and I think it's one where our knowledge of it and understanding of it is still, I would say, still quite an early stage of development. So there are very strong points of view around, for example, screen time for children
Mm,
and the whole engagement with a with sort of the digital world, which I think we're still exploring. And there's very conflicting evidence that too much screen time can be harmful, whereas there's research also says actually screen time managed effectively can be part of the good interaction with adults, parents, or educators and so on. So I think we're still exploring that. I think AI, as with every sphere of life, is going to have a huge impact on what we do.
mm,
One of the projects I'm involved in is using AI to support practitioners doing observations of children and how it leads to the practitioners understanding what the children need next.
mm,
So when you're observing a child, so in the olden days, when you're observing a child, you would say, well, this is what they know, this is what they're demonstrating, right? Their next step in learning or where they need to go next is this, and you would kind of work that out. So you might take notes with a pen on a clipboard, or you might write it in their records and so on. So the AI I've been involved in is saying, well, actually, if you make that observation and you record that observation, AI will then find what are the potential next steps in learning.
mm,
So you might say, what's their next step in terms of their language development? It might give you a series of questions you can ask or activities you can do and so on. And again, that's not changing the nature of teaching, but it's I think, as you said at one point, it's about speeding that up and making it much more accessible and much more effective. And I think that's a really important principle. So when when I was a teacher, we didn't even have the internet. So if I wanted to find out about something, I'd have to go to a library or I'd have to find an insight. Really long process. Whereas now, on your phone, you know you go on Wikipedia or you go on ChatGPT and you ask for it. Other AI models are available, and you have that within seconds rather than
mm,
days or months or whatever. So it's not actually changing the nature of that. It's changing the speed and the effectiveness of which you can do that.
mm,
The other thing I would say, and this is a big feature of my work in terms of developing learning behaviors, is developing the ability to critically analyze information because as you are aware, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of fake information. There's a lot of deliberately misleading information. So I think we really need to start, which I think is a learning behavior anyway, but we need to start ensuring children can process and verify in themselves what information is accurate and what isn't. How
mm,
back to metacognition, how do we know what we know? How do we make sure the information we're acting on is real information? It's not, false information or particular perceptions of information. So I
mm,
think those are the areas I think at the moment are where I would focus. But yeah, as I said, I think we're just coming to terms with some of it. And I think one of the things I'd always say is, if you had said 10 years ago, you can just put some bullet points into a program and it'll write an essay for you, I would have said, no, that sounds that sounds ridiculous.
mm, mm.
I remember, I'm old enough to remember when you could get the internet on your phone, and I thought, oh, what a weird idea, that'll never catch on. That's how good I am at proper, seeing the future. So I think, that one of the interesting things is we don't know, we can't even predict what the impact of AI will be because it will evolve, it will become even more sophisticated in ways that, I can't even imagine at this point. And it's, again, how we work with that and how we accommodate that into what we know are the good principles of why we do what we do.
And I guess, and knowing that, there's going to be good sides to AI, robotics tech, there's also
Yeah,
going to be negative, bad sides of it. I
yeah,
suppose that only really backs up the point you made at the beginning, that the importance of teaching children at a young age good, effective decision making.
yeah, yeah,
If they can do
absolutely.
that at an earlier age, then it can sort of take away some of the, not all of it, but some of the possible negative effects that AI might have in the future.
No,
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's always been something that we were aware of and it was important. But I think the sources from what you children received information were much, much more limited than they
Mm,
are now. I'm
yeah.
again talking 20 years ago. So I think even more so, being more finely tuned to that and being more finely tuned to how they absorb and classify information, I think is will be really important. And I think, which is always the case in early years, there will be different schools of thought
Yeah.
advocating different things, and it's finding a way of building at least a broad consensus of how that works.
Yeah. And well, what you said there as well about the 70% of the connections are made right by the time you're 7 years old, right?
Mm.
And with the amount of information that's fed to young people, that's only increasing now.
Yeah,
I always remember, you'll probably know better than me, but the kind of statistic where they'd explain, someone from the Middle Ages, how much information that they had
mm,
to process, on a day-to-day basis, extremely limited. We compare that to how much information is sent to
yeah,
us, sent to the brain
yeah,
now, or say in the 1990s, 2000s, and then even now
yeah,
it's getting even higher when you see young children, glued to smartphones, tablets. Uh, I suppose there are a lot of question marks there, right? What does it mean for children? Yeah, with
yeah.
that
And
much information.
absolutely, and as I said, I think we're exploring that research at the moment. And again, I think as you would expect, some of it is sort of conflicting, contradictory.
Mm,
Um, but you're right. I think how the sheer scale of the sheer scale and quantity of the information that we are bombarded with, relentlessly is. But again, is a difference. But again, it's about how you filter out what you need, and that is what the brain does.
yeah,
We filter information we need, and we discard information that we don't need. And I think it's again becoming conscious of that and being conscious of that as a ownable process that you can do.
yeah,
Um, yeah, and for young children, again, one of the big issues we have is children can be distracted, and actually when they need to focus in on things and really drill down, they need to be able to learn how to block out distractions. And
mm,
again, one of the theories says that actually digital screens actually um, undermine that. It undermines children's ability to block out distractions. So we're having to look at how we teach that as a skill, just like you would teach someone how to throw and catch a ball. You
mm,
can learn how to focus, you can learn how to block out distractions.
mm.
So I think AI has, as I said, shone a bright light on some of the fault lines we might already have, but
Yeah.
has made them slightly more intense. But that's a good thing. That's how you move forward. And I think it's finding those challenges and overcoming those challenges or addressing them that is part of what we do.
Amazing. What would you say, Jan, sort of going forward, for yourself, and for your work at Hempstall? Sort of what's the future look like, for you over the next kind of 5 years? And I suppose an added element to that, how does it feed into your sort of vision for early years education, and where we're heading?
That's a really good question. I think, as I said, I think one of the things I'm really interested in at the moment is looking at how we close that attainment gap based on social economic status. Now, one of the projects I'm doing with Hempstall is called Moving the Box, which is precisely that. It's about how do we ensure equity, not equality, not necessarily
Mm,
equality in what we're doing. And that's a really, really interesting piece of work. We're working with a number of local authorities to do that. The other thing, again, which is another part of my work, is how we embed those learning behaviours as part of the curriculum. So when I train or I work with people on curriculum, one of the questions or one of the outcomes of that is the curriculum is bigger than just knowledge content. It's about how you become an effective learner. How do you manage your self-regulation? How do you manage your inhibitory control? How do you sustain motivation and self-discipline? How do you manage your metacognition? How do you manage your retrieval? Your working with your short and long-term memory and so on. So I think this wider view of how we ensure that that's part of the curriculum and part of what we teach and children learn is really important. But we are at an interesting point. We've just had a document, Best Start in Life, from the government, which is the vision for early years. So I think watching that land and watching how that's going to impact on policy and practice, I think will be, excuse me, how that lands on policy and practice will be quite interesting. I know one of the things they've identified in that is, as I've said, closing that gap. Early years education can be transformative to life chances. Huge amounts of research, from years now, of children getting the right thing in early years changes the trajectory they would have had otherwise. And I think to an extent, there's a degree of frustration that that's not happening as well as it could do.
Yeah.
And I think, again, like I said, the Moving the Box project is part of that. So the other thing they also talked about is the reception year, 4 to 5-year-olds just before they start national curriculum, the final year of EYFS, and kind of really focusing on that underneath the controversial term of school readiness. I think that narrative is an interesting one because, again, it's looking at what do children need to be effective learners? What knowledges do they need? They need good language skills, physical skills, good general knowledge, all those sort of things. But also, what behaviours need to be underpinned to make that effective? And again, we're going back to that notion of learning behaviours. So I think it's an interesting time. I also think we are still working with the aftermath of the pandemic. The children who have just finished their reception year, they were born. They were the cohort who were born during lockdown. So they have had a very different early childhood from before the pandemic and post the pandemic. And it's interesting to see, again, how will that become the new normal, or will it revert back? So there are issues, for example, about physical development, about self-care, about language development, about social development. It's also an issue around parental anxiety, which, if someone gave birth during lockdown, I can't imagine how traumatic and significant that was. It's inevitable that parents will have anxiety as a result of that. So all of those things, I think, are still factors which we're still managing, and things change and evolve anyway. So it's interesting to see how that will sort of pan out in the future.
Yeah, I think, and I've mentioned it on a few different podcasts, the word COVID, and I'm loath to say it, but yeah, it is still relevant to a lot of discussions that we have, and especially when it comes to education and children at all age ranges, no matter how old they were when COVID happened. It is important to see what impact it has had, and I
Absolutely.
think then vitally is what intervention can we make to not correct, but to help
To at
maybe
least,
the negative
yeah,
aspects that they've picked
to at
up.
least,
Right.
to at least be aware of it. No, absolutely. I mean, we have a whole almost generation of children whose lives were incredibly impacted by it. As an early years specialist, I would say, particularly for young children, that was their reality.
Yeah.
Older children, at the very least, had a previous knowledge to reconnect to, whereas young
Yeah.
children didn't. This is what they experienced. But I think you're right. I think, right across the board, every single child from, up to 18 was impacted in some way, and I think how that then knock-on effect of that as they get older and they move sort of through life is really significant, and I think we have to be aware of that.
Amazing, yeah. So yeah, very important work that you're doing, Jan. And if anyone wants to reach out to you directly, what's the best contact details to get you on?
So I've got an email address which is just my name, Jan Dubiel at yahoo.com. You can also get in touch with me through Coram Hempstalls. But yeah, I mean, you have my email if people want to
I will put those contact details in the
I'll
comments
be
below.
more than happy to have a conversation with anyone about anything I've talked about today. Always keen to hear different perspectives, particularly, and think of ways of working with people. So yeah,
Amazing.
always interested.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jan. And yeah, thank
Thank
you
you so much.
for joining for this awesome discussion.
Thank you. Thanks very
Cheers.
much.
And thank you
Bye.
everyone for listening.
Bye.